Salvaged at the last minute, a new trade deal for Canada with the United States and Mexico. It replaces the contentious North American Free Trade Agreement. But is it a win-win situation? And have serious compromises been made? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. It was billed as the world's largest free trade area, affecting 500 million people, when the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was signed in 1994. Barriers were removed and trade boomed, but critics argued that it decimated several manufacturing hubs in the US, with companies taking advantage of lower wages in Mexico to shift operations south. US President Donald Trump promised to rewrite NAFTA or get rid of it completely. High-pressure negotiations followed. An unpopular outgoing government in Mexico struck a deal in August. Longtime ally Canada was left out, and relations deteriorated between Trump and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But the countries need each other economically, and both appear to have found things they like in the new agreement, to be called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Well, the US and Canada, in a joint statement, said that USMCA will give our workers, farmers, ranchers and businesses a high-standard trade agreement that will result in freer markets, fairer trade and robust economic growth in our region. It will strengthen the middle class and create good, well-paying jobs and new opportunities for the nearly 500 million people who call North America home. So, what was agreed upon? Well, Canada's giving US farmers greater access to its dairy market, but it gets to retain the trade dispute settlement mechanism established by NAFTA. Washington had earlier demanded that American courts should rule on cases filed by Canada against US duties on imports. Both Canada and Mexico have won protections against President Trump's threat to impose 25% tariffs on cars. But under the deal, 40 to 45% of any car completed in Mexico needs to be built in countries where workers earn at least $16 an hour. Only then will the car qualify for duty-free benefits. Let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Washington, we're joined by Chris Garcia. He is CEO of Vicker Financial, who was earlier Deputy Director at the US Department of Commerce under President Trump. And from Ottawa, Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat who was part of the team that negotiated NAFTA back in the 1990s. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Chris, let's start with you. Is this a good deal for all concerned or just for the US?
No, it's a great deal for everyone, frankly. I think this is why all three parties have now reached this agreement. Today, October 1st, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement has tackled several issues that, 25 years ago, perhaps could not have predicted. Intellectual property rights have increased. Worker protections, environmental standards have increased. Frankly, the U.S. has more access now to the Canadian dairy markets, as you'd mentioned. And we're having more auto parts and automobiles, frankly, made in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And this is truly a tradition, I would say, a complete reorientation of the supply chain away from Southeast Asia back to North America. I think all three nations can be proud of that.
Okay. Colin, a deal between the two of the sides, the Canada and the US side, appeared to be slipping out of reach as recently as last week, when Donald Trump made those disparaging comments about Canada and its negotiators at that press conference. What's changed?
Well, Adrian, I think as you point out, Donald Trump at the United Nations last week gave one of his what called Trump eruptions, but in a way it's straight out of the playbook of Art of the Deal. If you read his book, he puts maximum pressure. There's bullying, there's bravado, there's bluster before a deal is reached. And I think the Canadian negotiators and the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, and our negotiator, who he'd also slammed, Chrystia Freeland, our foreign minister, kind of just parked that and said, okay, this is just this. We are now more used to this after a year and a half of the Trump administration. What was important for us was to retain that access to the United States, because over the past year, our governor of our bank and our major companies have all said there's been a chilling of investment in Canada. Yes, we now have access to the European market through the new comprehensive European trade agreement, and we are, of course, with Mexico, part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Mr. Trump pulled out of. And what's interesting, Adrian, is that this agreement that we've just signed with the United States and Mexico most closely resembles the Trans-Pacific Partnership, both in language and in form. And as Chris points out, is an updating of it. My own sense, it is, with the trade-offs, a win-win-win for all three nations.
Chris, under this deal, US farmers are going to get access to 3.5% of Canada's $16 billion dairy market. Now, to me, 3.5% doesn't sound a lot. Why is that being touted as a success?
I think it's greater than the 3% that was agreed to in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not sure if that's the actual number that is coming out at the announcement that's being made today. But I know that that is significantly more than we have now. I think Canada is quite protective, as Colin has pointed out, of its dairy markets. They want to ensure that, of course, the Canadian farmers do not go bankrupt. The United States has similar protections in place for our farmers here. We want to take care of our own. We want to take care of our heartland, if you will. But I think that moving toward, even if it's a few percentage points at a time, toward a more free, open, and reciprocal trading arrangement in areas like dairy and access to Canadian dairy markets, I think that's ultimately a step forward rather than a step backward. But again, in exchange for that, we're also getting, or I should say, in addition to that, we're also getting access to more parts production, more automobile production in the United States. I think that is a major, major victory for both the U.S. and Canada. Again, the $16 per hour requirement on the 30% of vehicle part production must be done, of course, with labor of above $16 per hour. That is about 3 times the price of the average Mexican labor wage per hour. I think that's a major victory for the U.S. and Canada. So again, ultimately, I think what we're looking at is a win for both U.S. workers, American workers, and I think the Mexican economy as well. This is where we really see President Trump's leadership in action. 2 completely distinct, different leaders in Mexico and Canada, and yet President Trump was able to bring them together with his negotiators, who he empowered, to get this deal done.
Colin, you talked about President Trump and his bluster and the fact that the Canadian leadership, despite the fact that they appeared not to be getting on very well, President Trump and Justin Trudeau, but the Canadian leadership has sort of become used to this bluster and bravado. Donald Trump likes to talk himself up as being the deal maker. One could imagine that he's a pretty tough negotiator, or that his team would be under his direction. Did Canada have to make any big concessions here, or was this deal perhaps easier to reach than they thought it would be?
No, this has been tough. And indeed, even last week, our ambassador to the United States gave it a kind of 5 out of 10, and he's our kind of quarterback in the field, along with our foreign minister. So no, this was hard fought. We've been at it in an intense fashion now for a little over a year. Remember, we had been through this with the United States negotiators, many of whom the same people at the working level in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as I point out, the agreement itself most closely resembles the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with adjustments relating to the interests of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. I think that it was, from a Canadian perspective, kind of the optimum time, because there was pressure within the United States from the business community, the farm community, to include Canada in this. And with the clock ticking under the legislative mandate of Congress to the administration, they had to submit something today to Congress, and the preference was to do it Canada, U.S., and Mexico, because, and let's be clear on this, and I think Chris would agree, the big challenge now is going to be the implementing legislation in the Congress, and that's going to happen sometime next year, because in the meantime there'll be an economic assessment of this agreement by the International Trade Commission, and then the new Congress, as we post the midterms, will be the Congress responsible for implementing the new agreement, and that's not a slam dunk.
Yeah, Chris, is it a done deal? Okay, so we've come to an agreement, but it still has to be ratified by Congress. Could anything upset this bill's passage? I'm thinking about the midterms in November.
Sure, of course. Well, the United States, of course, has the major midterms in November 2018. We're looking likely to have at least the odds are showing that there may be a flip in the House. Democrats may retake the House. That's the historical precedent, at least. Every president loses the House in the midterm elections. I think it's only been 2 presidents who've kept the House in the midterm elections since I think the year 2000. And so, frankly, looking at this, the Senate as well, Senate looks increasingly as though the Republicans will keep the Senate, but you have many congressmen in both the House and Senate, senators in the Senate, that have districts that rely and would benefit tremendously by the influx of jobs, by the increase in wages for many of these manufacturing jobs that would require, as I mentioned earlier, the $16 per hour labor on many of the components and the significant percentage of the auto parts that are made. So it would be in their favor, whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, to vote in favor of this. And so I think that it looks very likely, it looks increasingly so, that with trade promotion authority that President Trump has, that Congress does in fact vote favorably for this deal.
Colin, of course, one of the things that helped to sour relations between Canada and the United States was earlier this year, President Trump slapped a bunch of tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminium imports. Does this trade deal, this new North America Free Trade Agreement under a different name, does that deal with that issue, or do those tariffs stay in place?
No, as I read the agreement, remember it's 1,000 pages and I'm still digesting it, and there are some side letters. My understanding is that those tariffs remain on place for both Canada and Mexico, although there is pressure in the United States from steel users because Canada is the biggest foreign supplier of steel, and particularly of aluminum, which is used particularly in the defense industry. So our Prime Minister has said American airplanes and tanks use our aluminum. And so the Americans are still buying it, but they're of course paying now the tariff at the border. Similar situation with our softwood lumber. We're selling as much softwood lumber as before, but the average American is now paying a 25% surcharge, and that of course raises the cost of housing in the United States. So that one is undone. Let's be clear, Adrian. We're not out of the Trump administration is protectionist, and we are likely to see more protectionism by this administration. The agreement gives us belt and suspenders, but we're not free, and so there will continue to be.
The Trump administration is not protectionist at all.
Go on, Chris. Yeah.
It's most protectionist for the
Trump administration is just not protectionist. We are a free trade administration, and frankly, this is why, and this is something I think you would agree with, Colin. We've had a significant breakthrough with the NAFTA deal back in 25 years ago when you negotiated it. It was a great deal for many people. However, what that did is it moved many jobs overseas. It reoriented the supply chain away from North America to Southeast Asia. The United States is simply saying, let's bring the manufacturing back to the United States. The tariffs, frankly, are not an end in and of themselves. They're a way to get the parties that have taken advantage of the United States, and frankly, those that have taken advantage of Canada as well, back to the table to renegotiate a more fair deal. This is not what the president wants. He's a free trader. His trade advisors are free traders as well.
You say that the Trump administration is a free trade administration. Why then are his own party, the Republicans, Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, so opposed to the tariffs that he's imposed on, staunch allies, Canada, the EU?
Well, I'll tell you why. That's because many establishment Republicans are selling out to industry. They're selling out to industry, the same industries, the same corporations that have built their empires on the backs of American labor that have been treated so unfairly. American workers have been treated so unfairly. And so a lot of individuals, a lot of establishment Republicans and many Democrats are simply corporate elitists that have sold out to many of their donors and corporate interests. What President Trump has done is say, I'm looking at this through the eyes of the average American worker. What does it do to my community when my entire heartland, the entire heartland of the United States has been hollowed out by these trade deals that have shipped jobs overseas? Let's get jobs back to the United States. And frankly, the record that he's produced so far, I think, is indicative of that. We've got 4 million jobs that are back in the United States, 400,000 manufacturing jobs that the previous President Obama said we're never going to come back to the United States. So I think that we have to understand some of the underlying issues here and give the president the benefit of the doubt when we look at just the facts.
Colin, what do you make of that?
Well, I would just say that it's, at the end of the day, a good day for Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Mr. Trump has his wins, as Chris points out, on manufacturing. He can say to auto workers, he can say to farmers that he's delivered for them. And from a Canadian perspective, having secure access to what is our largest trading partner, and worth pointing out, I think as Chris would recognize, that America's largest trading partner is Canada, and also worth pointing out that in fact the United States has a surplus with Canada in everything except energy, which of course is used to fuel the manufacturing industry in the United States. So I think all three countries can be satisfied that North America as a platform, we're not going to call it North America anymore, but the Canada, US, Mexico relationship is competitively placed to be able to continue to compete with the rest of the world. And if that brings jobs into Canada, the United States, and Mexico, that's a good thing.
Colin, do tariffs and other, I'll put them in inverted commas, protectionist policies, because I know Chris will disagree, but do tariffs and protectionist policies actually work, or do they lead ultimately to unforeseen adverse effects for consumers and for workers?
Well, I think the economists would suggest the latter. That is, they lead to adverse effects. Effectively, a tariff is a tax on a consumer. And so, as I point out, in the case of steel and aluminum tariffs, and in the case of the tariffs on softwood lumber, the average American house now costs about an extra $5,000. It's going to cost more to make the cars and planes out of the steel and aluminum. Well, you pass that through, it means you have probably less money for other things. But these are decisions governments take. What we've been moving towards was to try to reduce those tariffs. And I think Chris would probably agree that the biggest change was not the Mexico, Canada, it was more China coming into the World Trade Organization. I think there's no doubt that China did take advantage of a situation, and that's a separate issue that the president is trying to address.
Colin says that's a separate issue, but does this deal, the fact that all three are Canada, Mexico, and the US are praising it so highly, does this impact upon President Trump's threat to withdraw the US from the WTO?
Well, this definitely plays to President Trump's overall strategy. And again, just to repeat, tariffs are not something the president is looking to implement long term, nor are his trade advisors, nor have his trade advisors informed him that imposing tariffs in the long run are going to be a smart idea. They're simply a way to bring back the bad actors to the table, if you will, or to have some of our allies, even in the case of the NAFTA renegotiation, have them come back to the table to reciprocate some of or develop more of a reciprocal and free open trade agreement. How this plays into President Trump's overall strategy with China is that we now have a really strong position. Of course, economically speaking, the United States is doing extremely well. Our markets are up. The Chinese market is down. But this new deal, this new USMCA deal, allows us to be in unison with our allies north of the border and south of the border as we then turn our gaze toward China and tackle some of the more serious issues like IP theft, like forced technology transfer, like outright tariffs and barriers to entry. And even the Europeans have said, okay, you get this done, we'll make some noise about China and the WTO. So I think ultimately this was a tactic, simply the use of tariffs, if you will, and this hard bargain that the president has driven is a tactic to bring parties back to the table. And guess what? In the past, you had diplomatic solutions that were thought to be the answer. Well, in the last 2 decades, we've been getting ripped off in many occasions. Nothing's happened. The diplomatic solution has not worked. But guess what? Today, now we have a more fair deal for the United States. We are better off. American workers are better off, and we're not worse off.
Colin, I'm going to ask you to put your diplomat's hat on for a moment. You'll notice that we don't have a spokesperson, anyone commenting from Mexico. Everyone we reached out to today declined our invitation to appear. So I'm going to ask you, the Mexican side of this deal was negotiated by the outgoing administration of President Enrique Pena Nieto. To what extent does it tie the hands, do you think, of the incoming leftist administration?
Oh, it very much ties their hands. And in fact, incoming President Lopez Obrador had a very senior member who's likely to be in his cabinet, Jesus Said, present at the negotiations, particularly in later August. Remember, the outgoing administration of Pena Nieto, with their trade minister, Ildefonso Guajardo, negotiated. It actually began around the issue that Chris identified, the rules of origin relating to autos, and the wage component was a piece of that. They negotiated throughout August, and then suddenly they got a sort of a breakthrough and they negotiated an agreement. But the incoming administration is part of that. And remember, the incoming administration has already taken office in Congress, but they've got this kind of convoluted transition period in Mexico. The new president doesn't take office until December.
I'm going to eat my words now because, lo and behold, we have got someone from Mexico joining us on the program. In Mexico City, it's Fernando González Rojas, who's a professor of international trade at the Monterrey Institute of Technology and Higher Education in Mexico City. It's good to have you with us, sir. Welcome to Inside Story. Better late than never, as they say. Mexico's side of this deal was agreed long before the standoff with Canada was settled. Is it a good deal for Mexico?
Well, first of all, yes. I mean, this is good news because, as you said, it is better for the three countries having a NAFTA 2.0 than nothing. So in general, it's good news. Of course, we have to review the text of the agreement in detail to know to what extent we have improved our benefits and privileges as parties to the NAFTA than before. But in general, it's good news. So in fact, here in Mexico, we have welcomed the news that Canada has joined the boat. This is certainly better, having a trilateral agreement instead of bilateral agreement. And now it seems that the markets are reacting positively as well. So yes, this is good for Mexico.
Okay. And the question I put to Colin just a few moments ago, to what extent does this tie the hands, though, of the incoming administration?
Well, I mean, I would say that it is also good news for the new administration because having to start a new government with the uncertainty of not knowing whether there will be a NAFTA and in what terms, it's certainly something that would have caused a problem to the new administration. So it is good for them knowing that that problem is behind. Now, as it was mentioned previously by the previous speaker in your show, yeah, a very senior official participated directly in the negotiation room during this process. I mean, a senior official of the incoming government. So that means that they have been closely following these negotiations. So it's not that they will be giving a text they are entirely unfamiliar with. To the contrary, they probably know very well what Mexico has committed to with this NAFTA 2.0.
Okay. Chris, last week the US agreed to begin bilateral talks with Japan. It did the same with the EU back in July, and yet the trade war continues with China. Is that dispute hurting the US in any way? Where's that going to end?
Well, it will only hurt the United States if China continues to refuse and we reach a stalemate, frankly. I think that's not going to happen. China has much more to lose than the United States. As we had mentioned earlier, we are in a position of strength. Relatively speaking, our economy is thriving, it's booming, jobs are being created, businesses are being started, profits are seeing all-time highs, markets are seeing all-time highs in the United States. It's not the same case in China. Frankly, what we're seeing is China essentially getting caught red-handed with forced IP transfers, outright IP theft. I mean, China's entire R&D department is just IP theft. They don't really invent anything there. And you see President Trump calling them on that bluff.
Okay.
Now, the beauty of this strategy is that the EU and our allies north and south of the border, especially now after this new NAFTA 2.0 deal has been struck, is that we see them joining us now in approaching China and trying to get them to actually change some of these practices. So okay. I think, frankly, the United States does not have much to lose, but we will ultimately find a solution, an amicable solution with China.
Colin, do you agree with that? That China has more to lose than the US does?
I think both countries have a fair bit to lose, but I think that, as Chris points out, China was taking unfair advantage, talking about IP theft and the rest, and of course, overproduction, particularly of steel, is part of what got us into the steel tariffs and things. I think that the Chinese are sort of recognizing, and I think that we look to leadership usually from the United States. It's a rather strange leadership, but if the European, Canada, Mexico, and others can come together, there's already negotiations at the OECD and other place is to sort of say, all right, China, you've come into the club of the WTO, but now we expect you to truly live up to the spirit of the agreement. But of course, the WTO gets complicated. Mr. Trump is taking a different view on it as well. But I think that this, after all, was a U.S. creation, these international institutions. And I think these international institutions are still the best way to manage new members into the club, particularly China.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. Chris Garcia, Colin Robertson, and Fernando Gonzalez Rojas, very briefly there towards the end. And thank you, as always, for watching. You can see the programme again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.